Investigator Cole Ashby grabbed the front of her jacket, right there, in front of everyone. He ripped it loose before she could even raise a hand. The stitching tore first, then the fabric. Dana Whitfield's knees buckled, and she caught herself on the marble wall. 29 years old, a gas station cashier, the last piece of her brother she had left in this world, torn loose in 4 seconds. She reached for it anyway. Officer Grant Pruitt shoved her back so hard her shoulder cracked against the marble. A courthouse full of people froze in place and watched her slide down that wall. Somebody's phone kept recording. By evening, District Attorney Warren Kessler stood behind a podium and called it a victory for courtroom decorum. 20 miles away, Silas Van watched the footage a third time. He pulled the tarp off a motorcycle that hadn't moved in 6 months. The engine caught on the first kick. "Reno," he said into his radio. "Denver, Cheyenne, every Hell's Angels charter between here and that courthouse. We ride tonight. We're there before the ruling." By sunrise, 500 engines were closing in on Ash Grove. Stay with this one, because what happened at that courthouse next, nobody saw coming. The patch tore free before Dana Whitfield even understood what Cole Ashby's hand was doing. 1 second it was pinned to her jacket, the next it was in his fist, and the sound of the thread snapping was still hanging in the hallway air when her knees gave out and she caught herself on the marble wall. Ashby didn't stop moving. He folded the patch once, hard, and shoved it into a manila envelope he already had open in his other hand. Grant Pruitt stepped in front of her before she could reach for it. She reached anyway. He pushed her back. Her shoulder blade cracked against the marble hard enough that the sound carried down the hallway, past the elevator, past the bench where she'd been sitting 11 seconds earlier waiting for absolutely nothing like this. A woman near the elevator dropped her coffee. Nobody moved to pick it up. 12 people stood within 30 feet of that bench. A bailiff, 2 attorneys waiting for a different case, a court reporter on her lunch break, a family of 4 there for a custody hearing. Every one of them watched Dana Whitfield slide down that wall until she was sitting on the marble floor with her arms wrapped around her knees. Every one of them stayed exactly where they were. Grace Talbot did not. She was 26 years old, a freelance reporter who covered county court proceedings for a subscription newsletter nobody outside Ash Grove had ever heard of. She had her phone out before Ashby's fist finished closing around the patch. Pruitt turned and told her to put it away. The phone stayed up. Ashby took a step toward her, one hand raised in warning. The phone stayed up anyway. "I'm standing in a public hallway," she said. "You don't get to tell me what I can film in a public hallway." Ashby held her stare for 3 seconds. Then he turned and walked away with the envelope sealed under his arm, and Pruitt followed him, and neither of them looked back once. Dana sat on that floor for 11 seconds before anyone in the hallway said a single word to her. It was the mother from the custody hearing. She crouched down, put a hand on Dana's arm, and asked if she needed a doctor. Dana shook her head. She wasn't looking at the woman. She was looking at the empty patch of denim on her own jacket, at the 4 loose threads still hanging from where the stitching had been, at her own hands, which had not stopped shaking. She had worn that patch every day for 11 months. To work, to the grocery store, to her brother's grave on the 1st of every month, where she sat for exactly as long as it took to say the things she needed to say, and never any longer, because if she stayed longer, she wasn't sure she would be able to leave. It was the last thing Eli had made with his own hands that she could still touch. Now it was somewhere inside a manila envelope with a case number written across the top in Cole Ashby's handwriting, and there was nothing in the Ash Grove County Courthouse Decorum Ordinance that said anything about how a person was supposed to get a piece of their brother back once the county decided it was a threat. Grace Talbot crouched down next to her, set the phone face down on the marble, and said nothing at all. She just stayed there on the floor beside Dana Whitfield until Dana's hands finally stopped shaking. By then, 41 seconds of footage were already uploading to a server 60 miles away. Neither of them knew it yet, but the video had already started moving. To understand why 2 county investigators felt confident enough to tear a memorial patch off a grieving woman's jacket in a public hallway, you have to go back 7 weeks. Vantage Freight Logistics was losing a lawsuit it could not afford to lose. The civil case was simple on paper. 11 months earlier, one of the company's freight trucks had crossed the center line on Route 41, outside Ashgrove, and struck a motorcycle, carrying Eli Whitfield. The driver had been awake for 19 hours, on a route that Vantage's own scheduling software had flagged as a fatigue risk 3 separate times that week. The Whitfield family's attorney had the flagged reports. He had the driver's logbook. He had a jury pool in Ashgrove County that had grown increasingly unfriendly toward the company after 2 smaller trucking accidents the previous year. Patricia Vance had been Vantage's vice president of legal affairs for 6 years, and she understood exactly what that jury pool meant for the number the company was about to pay. Her internal estimate, given to the board in a closed session, was between $4 million and $7 million, depending on how sympathetic the jury found the Whitfield family. She had watched enough juries in enough small counties to know that sympathy was not an abstraction. It was a number with decimal points. And right now, everything about the Whitfield family read as sympathetic. A young sister who visited her brother's grave every month. A mother who had sewn his memorial patch by hand. A community of bikers who showed up in force for every hearing to sit quietly in the gallery. Vance did not need to win the case on the facts. The facts were already lost. She needed to change what the jury felt when they looked at the family bringing it. She requested a meeting with District Attorney Warren Kessler on a Tuesday afternoon in September, in his office on the 3rd floor of the Ashgrove County Courthouse. She brought no assistant. She brought one folder. Kessler was 48 years old and had held the office of District Attorney for 9 years, largely uncontested, largely unnoticed outside the county line. He had ambitions that extended past Ashgrove, a state attorney general's race in 3 years, conversations that had already begun quietly with 2 donors in Denver, and he had learned, the way ambitious men in small counties learn, that a high-profile win mattered more to a resume than 10 quiet ones. Vance sat across from him and did not waste time. "I'm not here about the criminal side of anything," she said. "I'm here about optics." Kessler waited. "The Whitfield case is going to a jury in 4 months," she said. "Right now, that jury is going to see a grieving sister and a dead veteran and a company with deep pockets. That's not a fact pattern. That's a narrative, and narratives are the only thing that actually moves a jury in this county." She opened her folder and slid 1 page across the desk. "I did some reading," she said. "Your courthouse has a decorum ordinance on the books. Section 4 prohibits emblems or insignia associated with organizations deemed threatening to courtroom proceedings. It's never been enforced. It's also never been repealed." Kessler read it once, then again. "You want me to enforce a dress code," he said. "I want you to change what that jury sees when they look at this family," Vance said. "Right now they see grief. I need them to see something more complicated than grief. An organization with a reputation. A sister who wears its symbol every single day, including inside your courthouse. If the county itself treats that patch as a threat serious enough to confiscate as evidence, that impression doesn't disappear from a juror's mind just because a judge tells them to disregard it. It sits there. It works quietly. That's all I need it to do." Kessler turned the page over, as if there might be something on the back that made this simpler than it sounded. "There's no active charge against her," he said. "No case where that patch is actually evidence of anything. There will be a public record of a seizure," Vance said. "A courthouse filing. A news cycle if we're fortunate. That's enough. I'm not asking you to convict anyone of anything, Warren. I'm asking you to create one afternoon that changes the emotional temperature of a case worth millions of dollars to my client, and no small amount of visibility to you, going into a statewide race, as a prosecutor who takes courtroom security seriously." She let that last part sit on the desk between them for a moment. Kessler had been in politics long enough to recognize the shape of what was being offered, without either of them naming it directly. "I'll need it to look procedural," he said. "Like something that could have happened to anyone. It will look exactly like a courthouse enforcing its own rules," Vance said. "That's the entire point. Roy Fenwick had been chief of courthouse security for the Ashgrove County Courthouse for 16 years, and he heard about Section 4 being activated the way he heard about most decisions made above his authority, after the fact, through a memo forwarded by a clerk who assumed he already knew. He walked into Kessler's office without an appointment. "Warren," he said, "talk me through this." Kessler didn't look up from his desk. "Courthouse decorum," he said. "Long overdue enforcement. Nothing more complicated than that." Fenwick set the memo down on the desk between them. "This ordinance was written in 1991, he said, after a bomb threat. It was written to keep people from bringing something dangerous into a building, not to give two investigators the authority to walk up to a grieving woman and take a piece of cloth off her jacket." Kessler finally looked up. "It's within the letter of the ordinance, Frank. The letter of a law nobody's touched in 30 years doesn't tell you whether using it now is a good idea," Fenwick said. "You're going to enforce this against exactly one family, at exactly the moment their civil case against Vantage Freight is heating up. And you think nobody's going to notice the timing?" Kessler's expression didn't change. "The timing is a coincidence," he said. "The ordinance stands on its own." Fenwick studied him for a long moment. He had watched Kessler build a career out of careful, deniable moves for 9 years, and he recognized the particular stillness of a man who had already made a decision and was simply waiting for the room to catch up to it. "You're about to find out what that family rides with," Fenwick said, "and when it comes back on you, I want it on record that I told you not to do this." "Noted," Kessler said. Fenwick left the memo on the desk and walked out. He should have put his own objection in writing. He never did. Cole Ashby and Grant Pruitt received their assignment from a supervisor 2 levels below Kessler, in language stripped of everything Vance and Kessler had discussed in that office 3 weeks earlier. Enforce Section 4 during the Whitfield preliminary hearing. Document any violation. Confiscate as evidence if necessary. Neither man had been on the job longer than 16 months. Section 4 had never been enforced before, not once, in the collective memory of the Ashgrove County Sheriff's Office. They read the ordinance the way young men read anything they've been told matters. Carefully, then confidently, then completely certain they understood something that had taken lawyers 3 weeks to construct. Patricia Vance was a name neither of them had ever heard. The $4 to $7 million, the jury pool, the closed board session, the folder that had crossed Warren Kessler's desk on a Tuesday afternoon in September, none of it had reached them, and none of it was going to. They knew a young woman would be sitting in the courthouse hallway on Thursday morning, wearing a patch that matched the description in the memo, and they knew that whoever handled it would be the one whose name ended up in the file when this went well. They thought about their names ending up in the file. Whose brother that patch belonged to never once crossed their minds. If you've ever wondered how an ordinary rule turns into an instrument for hurting someone, watch closely here. It rarely starts with cruelty. It starts with a memo that leaves out the one detail that would have made a decent person hesitate. Eli Whitfield joined Dust Row MC when he was 23 years old, 4 months after leaving the Army and finding that civilian life didn't come with the kind of structure he'd spent 6 years learning to need. He told Dana about it over breakfast at the diner they'd been going to since they were kids, the two of them splitting a plate of eggs the way they'd split everything since their mother died, and it had just been the two of them figuring out how a family worked with only 2 people left in it. "It's not what you think," he told her. "Nobody's asking me to do anything I don't want to do. It's just guys who show up. Guys who call to check if you're okay and actually wait for the answer." Dana had been skeptical. She'd seen the patches on television, the news stories, the version of the club that made for good footage and bad understanding, but she watched her brother over the next 3 years. Watched him get steadier. Watched him show up to her apartment unannounced with a toolbox when her water heater broke. Watched him sit with her for 6 hours, the night their mother's estate finally closed, and neither of them could stop crying about a woman who'd been gone 4 years by then. She watched what the patch actually meant, underneath what it looked like from the outside. The wings on Eli's memorial patch weren't decorative. They were the same wings that appeared on the back of every member's vest in Dust Row MC, a mark that took years to earn and that Eli had earned in his 4th year, after riding 2,000 miles in a single week to sit beside a member's hospital bed in Sacramento because nobody else could get there in time. Their mother, Carol Whitfield, learned to sew leatherwork the year Eli patched in, because she wanted to understand the thing that had given her son back to himself. She made the memorial patch by hand in the 11 days after his funeral, working at her kitchen table until 3 in the morning some nights, getting the gold thread exactly right, getting the wings exactly right, because Dana had asked her for one thing and one thing only. "I want something I can wear every day," Dana had said. "Something that isn't just a photograph in a frame." Carol Whitfield died 8 months after finishing it. A heart attack in her sleep, in the same house where she'd raised both her children alone after their father left. Dana buried her mother wearing the patch her mother had made her, and after that the patch stopped being just about Eli. It became the only object left in the world that both of them had touched. Dana wore it to the gas station where she worked the register 6 days a week. She wore it to the grocery store, to the pharmacy, to every ordinary errand that made up an ordinary life, because taking it off felt like agreeing that grief was supposed to have a schedule, supposed to fit into appropriate hours and appropriate settings, and Dana had decided a long time ago that she wasn't going to organize her loss around anyone else's comfort. Once a month, on the 1st, she drove out to the cemetery on the edge of town and sat at her brother's grave for exactly as long as it took to tell him about the last 30 days. The gas station, the customers, a rerun of a show they used to watch together that had come on the night before and made her laugh out loud alone in her apartment before it made her cry. She never stayed longer than 20 minutes. She had learned, in the 11 months since the accident, that 20 minutes was the exact amount of time she could sit with the size of what she'd lost before the size of it became too large to carry back to the car. The patch went with her every time. She would touch the stitching along the edge of the wings before she stood up to leave, the way another person might touch a photograph, the way a hand finds something without needing to look for it. She had touched it that way in the courthouse hallway on Thursday morning, 20 minutes before Cole Ashby tore it off her jacket, without any idea that anything was about to change. Dana spent the day after the courthouse hallway trying every channel a person is supposed to try. She called the clerk of court's office first thing in the morning. A tired voice told her that items seized under a courthouse decorum violation followed standard evidence procedure and could not be released until the matter was formally reviewed. When Dana asked how long that review typically took, the voice paused for a long moment before answering. 60 to 90 business days, the voice said. Sometimes longer, depending on caseload. 60 to 90 business days. She drove to the district attorney's office at 10 in the morning and waited in a hard plastic chair for nearly an hour before a young man in a gray suit came out, listened to her for 4 minutes with the careful blankness of someone trained to give nothing away, and told her that Mr. Kessler's office did not comment on matters related to active courtroom security procedures. She called 3 attorneys before noon. The first one didn't handle disputes with county government. The second wanted a retainer of $4,000 before he would even open a file. The third, a soft-spoken woman named Ruth Halloran who had practiced family and civil law in Ashgrove for close to 30 years, listened to the entire story without interrupting, and then explained, gently but plainly, that a decorum ordinance gave a courthouse extraordinarily broad discretion, that filing a brand new emergency motion to force the item's return could take months, and that by the time such a motion worked its way through the docket, the damage it was meant to undo would already be done. Dana thanked her and hung up. She sat in her car in the parking lot of Ruth Halloran's office for a long time without starting the engine. The preliminary hearing itself hadn't gone anywhere. It was still open, still sitting on the court calendar, scheduled to reconvene the following Monday morning, a routine continuation, barely a footnote on a crowded docket, where a judge would decide whether the patch taken from her jacket would be formally entered into the court record as evidence. Once it was entered, it stayed entered, cited in every future filing, referenced in every future headline, exactly the quiet, permanent impression Patricia Vance had built her entire plan around. Grace Talbot's footage had been viewed 2 million times by that afternoon. It had been shared by 3 national news accounts, a state senator, a former Army officer with a following in the hundreds of thousands who had posted it with a single line of caption, "This is what happens to the family of a fallen brother in Ashgrove County." 2 television vans had already parked outside the gas station where Dana worked, and her manager had quietly asked her to take the rest of the week off. Not as a punishment, he said, but because the story was becoming bigger than the register she worked behind. 4 million people had seen her slide down that wall. Getting her brother's patch back was still, for every one of them, someone else's problem to solve. That evening, District Attorney Warren Kessler appeared on the local news for the second time in 2 days, seated across from a friendly anchor, under soft studio lighting that had clearly been arranged well in advance. He said he understood emotions were running high. He said he respected the pain of any family that had lost someone. Then he leaned forward, the practiced lean of a man landing a point he had rehearsed in a mirror, and said that what the footage actually showed, watched carefully, was 2 investigators enforcing a courthouse rule that had existed for over 3 decades, applied evenly and without prejudice to anyone. He said the real story wasn't a piece of fabric. The real story was why a woman felt entitled to bring the insignia of an organization with a documented history of intimidation into a building where impartial justice was supposed to be the only thing in the room. He said the word entitled, the way politicians say it, when they want a feeling to land without ever having to defend the accusation directly. Dana watched his mouth move on the small television in her kitchen and felt something go cold and still behind her sternum, a stillness that had nothing to do with calm. She thought about Ruth Halloran and 60 to 90 business days. She thought about the manila envelope with Cole Ashby's handwriting across the top. She thought about her mother at the kitchen table at 3 in the morning, getting the gold thread exactly right. Her phone rang at 11:41 that night, a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer. She had spent the entire day learning, in careful and exhausting detail, exactly how alone a person could be inside a system that used the word procedure the way other people used the word no. She answered anyway. "Mrs. Whitfield," a voice said, slow, unhurried, the particular quiet of someone who has already decided everything he's going to say before he says it. "My name is Silas Van. Your brother rode with us for 6 years. I've watched that footage more times than I can count tonight." Dana closed her eyes. "What do you want?" she asked. "Nothing from you," Van said. "I want to buy you breakfast. There's a diner on Route 9, out past the old feed mill. 7 in the morning, if you're willing." Dana looked at the ceiling of her kitchen for a long moment. She had spent an entire day doing everything the system told her to do. Every proper form, every listed office, every legitimate door available to a person in her position. And she was exactly nowhere. "I'll be there," she said. The diner on Route 9 had a hand-painted sign that had faded so badly the name was mostly guesswork, and a bell over the door that rang twice when Dana walked in at 6:58 the next morning. Silas Van was already in the back booth. She recognized him from a photograph she'd found at 2 in the morning, searching Dust Row MC until she found an old newsletter with his face in it, broad through the shoulders in the way of a man who had spent decades doing physical work. A gray beard kept close and neat, forearms marked with ink that told a longer story than she had time to read from across the room. He stood when she approached, didn't extend his hand right away, waited to see if she wanted to shake it first. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, "thank you for coming." She sat across from him. A waitress appeared and filled her coffee cup without being asked, the way waitresses in diners like this one always seem to know without asking. Van set down the newspaper he'd been reading and looked at her with the direct, unhurried attention of a man who had decided a long time ago that the fastest way between 2 people was honesty. "Tell me what happened," he said. "Not the video. What happened before the video?" So Dana told him. She told him about the 11 months since the accident. She told him about her mother staying up until 3 in the morning with a needle and gold thread. She told him about the 20 minutes at the cemetery on the 1st of every month, never longer, because longer was more than she could carry. She told him about Cole Ashby's fist closing around the patch, and the sound the thread made when it gave out, and the exact moment her knees stopped holding her up. Van listened without interrupting once. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee cup slowly on the table. "I knew your brother," he said finally. 2,000 miles to Sacramento in a week, because a brother needed someone at his bedside and Eli wasn't going to let him wake up alone. That's not a story people tell about us, but it's the true one. He looked up at her. "That patch your mother made," he said. It's not decoration. It's a promise made in thread. And a man in that courthouse decided a promise like that was a threat to public order. Dana felt her hands tighten around the coffee cup. "What happens now?" she asked. Van was quiet for a moment, the particular stillness of a man who had already made his decision the moment he finished watching the footage the first time. "Now," he said, "we go get it back. Properly. In front of every camera that was there when they took it." His voice never rose above the hum of the diner around them the entire time he said it. "If you've made it this far, stay a little longer. What happens on that highway in the next few hours is the part people talk about years later." Ashgrove woke up to the sound of engines. It started as a low hum on the edge of town around 5 in the morning, the kind of sound most people mistook for distant thunder, until it didn't fade the way thunder fades. By 5:40, it had a shape to it. By 6, it had a direction. And by the time the sun cleared the ridge east of the county line, every resident of Ashgrove with a window facing Courthouse Square understood that the sound rolling toward them was not weather. It was 500 motorcycles, moving in staggered columns down Route 9, and they were not slowing down as they approached downtown. They didn't need to block the road. The road blocked itself the moment the first 100 bikes filled it end to end, and the ones behind simply kept coming, filling every inch of asphalt around the Courthouse Square, until the entire block sat inside a ring of leather and chrome that had arrived without a single broken taillight, without a single raised fist, without giving anyone with a camera one image that was anything other than controlled. Silas Van rode at the front. He parked directly in front of the courthouse steps, killed the engine, and didn't move from the seat for almost a full minute, letting the sound behind him settle into silence. Then he got off the bike, unfolded a lawn chair someone passed forward from 3 rows back, and sat down to wait. He was still sitting there when the first news van arrived. By 7 o'clock, 4 camera crews had set up along the courthouse fence line. By 7:30, the number of vehicles trying to reach downtown Ashgrove had backed traffic up past the county line in 3 directions. By 8, the story had a name on every local news ticker in the region. The courthouse siege that wasn't a siege at all, because nobody inside that ring of motorcycles had said a single threatening word, filed a single complaint-worthy act, or given the Ashgrove County Sheriff's Office one legal reason to move against them. They were simply present, 500 of them, sitting quietly in the September sun, waiting for the hearing to reconvene at 9 o'clock that morning, a hearing that, by 8:15, absolutely nobody inside the courthouse believed could reasonably proceed as planned. Dana Whitfield sat on the hood of her car at the edge of the square, close enough to see the courthouse steps, far enough back that she wasn't part of the ring itself. Grace Talbot stood beside her, camera lowered for the first time in an hour, watching the same thing everyone else in Ashgrove was watching. Neither of them said much. There wasn't much left to say that the engines hadn't already said better. Roy Fenwick left the courthouse alone. He told his deputy chief where he was going, and told him not to send anyone after him. He walked out the front doors, down the steps, and across 200 feet of open pavement toward the folding chair where Silas Van sat reading a section of newspaper someone had handed him from the crowd. The bikes parted for him without being asked. He noticed the discipline of it, the way 500 strangers moved exactly enough to let one man through and not 1 inch more. Van looked up when Fenwick stopped in front of him. He folded the newspaper. He didn't stand. "Roy," he said. "Silas," Fenwick said. It had been years since he'd used the man's given name instead of his road name, but something about the morning made it feel like the right one to use. Van studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod, the kind a man gives when he recognizes an old respect that hasn't gone anywhere. "Kessler wants to talk," Fenwick said. "I imagine he does," Van said. "What are your terms?" Van didn't hesitate. He'd known the answer since 7:55 the previous morning, sitting across a diner booth from Dana Whitfield with a cup of coffee going cold in front of him. "Section 4, he said. "Repealed, publicly, today. Signed and announced before a single bike on this square moves an inch." Fenwick nodded slowly. "I can push that through this morning. He's desperate enough right now to sign almost anything." Second, Van said, every filing connected to the seizure, dismissed. Completely. No lingering paperwork, no quiet reopening in 3 months once the cameras leave. Done, Fenwick said. What else? Van was quiet for a moment. Around them, 500 riders waited in the particular silence of people who had already proven everything they came to prove simply by being there. The patch, Van said. Fenwick looked at him. Dana Whitfield's patch, Van said again, and something in his voice shifted. Not louder, but more deliberate. The careful weight of a man talking about something that actually mattered to him. I want it returned by the hands that took it. Warren Kessler, standing in front of every camera that watched him call taking it a victory. He looked at Fenwick steadily. Past every camera on that fence line, Van said. Past every person watching this on a screen right now. He fixes it the way he broke it, in public, with his own hands. So every person who watched him smile about taking it gets to watch him give it back. The wind moved across the square. Somewhere behind them, a horn sounded once and stopped. Fenwick exhaled slowly. That's going to end him politically, he said. Completely. Van's expression didn't change. He had a woman's shoulder cracked against a marble wall on camera, he said. He had a memorial her own mother stitched, by hand, torn off her jacket in a public hallway, and called it decorum. He made her feel like nothing in front of a reporter, and a room full of people who did nothing to stop it. Fenwick was quiet for a long moment. He thought about the memo he'd carried into Kessler's office 3 weeks earlier, and the way Kessler hadn't even looked up from his desk. He thought about the words he'd used. You're about to find out what that family rides with, and how little weight they'd carried in that room compared to how much weight they carried now, sitting in a folding chair across from the man those words had been about. I'll get him, Fenwick said. He walked back the way he came. It took 40 minutes. 40 minutes for Fenwick to reach Kessler's office. 40 minutes for a conversation neither man ever described in full detail afterward, though a junior clerk who overheard part of it through a closed door later said it was the quietest, most one-sided conversation she'd ever heard happen in that building. 40 minutes for the clerk of courts to retrieve a manila envelope with a case number written across the top in Cole Ashby's handwriting, and for someone to carefully remove its contents and press the folded leather flat again. Dana watched the courthouse doors from the hood of her car. She watched them open. Warren Kessler stepped out into the morning light, looking like a man who had aged considerably since his interview 2 nights earlier. His suit jacket was still on, but it hung differently now. The tie loosened, one hand running once through hair that had come slightly undone. Draped carefully across both his forearms was a folded patch with a set of wings stitched in gold thread. He carried it the way a person carries something they have only just understood they never had the right to touch. The 500 riders watched him come and made no sound at all. No jeering, no revving engines. Just the particular quiet of people who had already won and didn't need to perform it. Kessler walked the full length of open pavement between the courthouse doors and the front line of motorcycles, every step of it inside the frame of 4 television cameras, and however many phones were recording from the crowd behind the fence line. He stopped in front of Silas Van. Van stood. They were close to the same height. Kessler in his loosened tie and unsteady hands, Van in his colors with decades in his forearms and an expression that gave nothing away. Kessler held out the patch. His hands were not entirely steady. Section 4 has been repealed, he said. His voice barely carried past the first row of bikes. The filing against Miss Whitfield's property has been dismissed, effective immediately. Van looked at the patch for a long moment before he reached out and took it with both hands. He turned it over slowly. He ran his thumb along the seam where the thread had torn loose, checking the stitching the way a man checks something he intends to protect for a long time. He folded it once, carefully, and looked up at Kessler. "Mr. Kessler?" he said. Kessler met his eyes for the first time since walking out the courthouse doors. "I hope," Van said quietly, "that this was worth what it cost you, because what you tried to take from that young woman, from her mother's memory, from her brother, from every person standing on this pavement today, that was never yours to take. You don't get to decide what a promise stitched in thread is worth. You don't get to weigh it against a jury pool and find it inconvenient. He paused. "That's the thing about a promise like this one," Van said. "It doesn't negotiate." Kessler said nothing. There was nothing left to say. He turned and walked back across the pavement, past the cameras, past the silence, past 500 people who watched him go without a single word. He reached the courthouse doors. They closed behind him. Van watched him go. Then he turned to face the riders who had come through the night to sit in a September morning for 3 hours, who had shut down a county courthouse square without breaking a single law or throwing a single punch, or giving one camera on that fence line an image that was anything other than disciplined and complete. He didn't make a speech. He raised one hand and made a single forward motion. 500 hands reached for 500 ignition switches. The sound that followed was not a roar. It was something larger than a roar. It was the sound of something that had been held very still for a very long time, finally being allowed to move. 500 engines firing in a cascade that rolled outward through the formation like a wave, shook the glass in the courthouse windows, and sent every pigeon on the square scattering into the September sky at once. Dana felt it before she heard it. She pressed both hands flat against the hood of her car and felt the metal vibrate up through her palms and into her chest, and she understood, in that single moment, something Eli had tried to explain to her for years about what that sound meant to the people who rode inside it. It meant a promise had been kept. The formation rolled forward in staggered columns, 500 bikes moving south and east and west away from Ashgrove, dispersing at the county line toward Nevada, Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, back to the charters and the garages and the ordinary lives they had left 2 nights earlier, without a word to anyone waiting for them at home. Silas Van was the last to go. He paused at the edge of the square and looked back once toward the spot where Dana Whitfield stood beside her car. He held up the folded patch, just once, so she could see it was safe. She raised one hand. He raised one hand back. Then he turned his bike south and rode away, and the sound of his engine folded into the sound of 500 others until there was nothing left of any single one of them. He was gone before the first reporter even thought to look for him. 3 miles down Route 9, his taillight already swallowed by the morning traffic. Gone before anyone could stop him for so much as a thank you. Dana walked into the courthouse square once the last engine had faded, past Grace Talbot, who was still filming, past the 4 news crews scrambling to get statements from anyone who would give one, past a bailiff standing frozen at the top of the steps. Roy Fenwick was waiting near the courthouse doors. He held the folded patch out to her with both hands, the way it had been handed to him 20 minutes earlier. "I'm sorry it came to this," he said. "I told him not to do it, for whatever that's worth to you now." Dana took the patch from him. "It's worth something," she said. She turned it over in her hands, the way Van had, checking the stitching along the seam where the thread had torn loose. It held. Her mother's work had held. Grace Talbot stepped up beside her, camera lowered for good this time. "I filmed 41 seconds that started all of this," she said. "I've filmed a lot of things in this county. I've never filmed anything I was prouder to have gotten right." Dana looked at her for a long moment. "Thank you for not putting the phone away," she said. The fallout began within the week. A state ethics commission opened an inquiry into the enforcement of Section 4, less than 5 days after the footage from the courthouse square reached national news outlets, driven largely by a court reporter's sworn statement describing what she had witnessed in the hallway, and by Grace Talbot's unedited 41 seconds of footage, which by then had been viewed more than 9 million times. The commission's preliminary findings, released 6 weeks later, concluded that the ordinance had been selectively enforced against a single family in a manner that coincided directly with an active civil lawsuit involving that family, and that the timing raised what the report called a significant and unresolved question of prosecutorial misconduct. Warren Kessler resigned as district attorney on a Thursday morning in November. He gave a short statement from his home. No podium, no press conference, no Navy suit. Just a folded piece of paper he read from once and didn't repeat questions about afterward. He said he had spent 9 years telling himself that a good outcome excused a bad reason for reaching it. He said Patricia Vance's folder had crossed his desk on a Tuesday afternoon, and he had known within the first 2 minutes of reading it exactly what he was being asked to do. And he had said yes anyway. because a state Senate donor list mattered more to him that day than a woman he had never met. He said he understood now, too late for it to matter to anyone but himself, that a decision made for the wrong reason doesn't stop being wrong just because you can point to the paperwork afterward. Patricia Vance left Vantage Freight Logistics the same month, following an internal review triggered by the Ethics Commission's findings and by a deposition, taken as part of the Whitfield civil suit, in which Vance's own emails to Kessler's office were entered into evidence. The Whitfield family's attorney read 3 lines from one of those emails aloud in open court, and the jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a verdict substantially larger than Vance's original internal estimate. Cole Ashby and Grant Pruitt were placed on administrative leave, pending an internal investigation, and both ultimately received formal disciplinary action, along with mandatory civil rights retraining. Ashby left the department 8 months later for a position outside law enforcement. Pruitt stayed, and according to 2 colleagues who worked alongside him afterward, became a noticeably more careful investigator, the kind who read the full ordinance before acting on it, and asked a supervisor when something didn't sit right. Roy Fenwick retired the following spring, after 17 years of service. At his retirement dinner, held at a small restaurant on the edge of town, Silas Van showed up without an invitation, sat in the back, had 1 cup of coffee, and left before anyone gave a speech. Fenwick saw him on his way out. They shook hands in the parking lot and didn't say much. They didn't need to. Dana Whitfield went back to work at the gas station the Monday after the courthouse square emptied out. She rang up coffee and gas and lottery tickets. She drove home. She made dinner for one, the way she'd been doing for 11 months, except that now the patch was pinned back to her jacket, exactly where it had always been. The stitching along the edge slightly thicker where her mother's original thread had been reinforced by a leather worker from Dust Row MC who had asked for nothing in return. She thought, sometimes, about what Silas Van had said to her across a diner table on a morning when she had run out of proper channels and legitimate offices and everything else the system had told her to try. Now, he had said, we go get it back. She understood, months later, that the real conversation had never actually been with Warren Kessler, or the Ethics Commission, or the civil jury that eventually ruled in her family's favor. Those were consequences. They mattered, but they were not the center of anything. The real conversation had happened on a September morning outside a courthouse, in a silence made out of 500 people who had nothing to gain and had come anyway. It had said, without a single word needing to be spoken, "We see what was taken. We came before the ruling, and we will always come." 6 months after the courthouse square, Dust Row MC held its spring gathering at the same diner on Route 9, and Dana was there, seated near the back with a plate of eggs she hadn't finished, when a 19-year-old prospect named Tyler Voss sat down across from Silas Van to ask what a memorial patch actually meant, and why the club treated the ones stitched by hand differently from the ones bought from a supplier. Van didn't answer right away. He reached into his vest and set something on the table between them, a photograph of a folded patch with a set of gold wings, resting inside a simple wooden frame that now hung on the wall of the Dust Row clubhouse, just inside the front door, where every member saw it on the way in and on the way out. That, Van said, is what it costs to forget somebody carefully instead of quickly. And that's what it costs the rest of us to make sure nobody has to do it alone. The young man looked at the photograph for a long time before he asked his next question. Dana finished her eggs and didn't say anything at all. The frame on the wall was already saying it for her. Some people spend their whole lives believing that power lives inside a title, a badge, a courtroom seal, a signature on an ordinance nobody thought to question in 30 years. Warren Kessler believed that too. Right up until the moment he carried a piece of stitched leather 200 feet across an open courthouse square and placed it back into the hands it had always belonged to. Power, it turns out, was never in the title. It was in the people willing to ride through the night for something the law had decided was too small to matter. A promise, sewn by a mother's hand, that said someone would not be forgotten quietly. Dana Whitfield knew that the moment she pinned that patch back on. She had known it every day for 11 months before anyone tried to take it from her. It just took the rest of Ashgrove a little while to understand it, too. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Hit subscribe, and drop a comment below telling me, what was the moment that got you? This is Heart Tales. New stories every week. Real stories. Human stories. The kind that remind you what people are capable of. 2 more are waiting for you on screen right now. Stay close.